Gina Moretti. She was standing in his conference room with her arms crossed, watching his legal team fumble through a merger presentation like they'd never opened a contract before. She didn't look impressed. She should have been. Most people were when they stepped into the glass and steel empire he'd built from nothing. The 54th floor of the Hale Corporation Tower offered views of the entire city, a kingdom he'd carved out with ruthless precision and zero sentiment. But Gina's dark eyes swept across the mahogany table, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the men in $12,000 suits, and landed on him with something that looked almost like boredom. "Mr. Hale," his head counsel stammered, "this is Gina Moretti. She's the litigation specialist Miller and Associates sent over to handle the Westbrook acquisition." Josiah didn't extend his hand. He never did, not in business. "You're late. Your team gave me the wrong floor number." Her voice was calm, measured. No apology. Twice. Someone in the room actually gasped. Josiah felt something shift in his chest, a flicker of interest he immediately crushed. He was 42 years old. He'd built an empire by knowing exactly when to cut losses, when to push advantages, and when to walk away. He'd learned that emotions were liabilities, that attachment was weakness. This woman was here to do a job, nothing more. "Then let's not waste any more time," he said, his voice flat. "Show us what Miller sent you here for." She did. For the next hour, Gina dismantled every weak point in the acquisition strategy with surgical precision. She didn't grandstand. She didn't perform. She simply laid out the facts with a clarity that made his own legal team look like first-year law students. She was brilliant, and she was 28 years old. Josiah noticed that detail on the consultant profile someone had left on his desk. He noticed other things too. The way she didn't fidget when he stared at her, the way she met his challenges with even sharper ones, the way her hands moved when she explained complex liability structures. He noticed, and he hated that he noticed. "That's the strategy," she concluded, closing her laptop with a soft click. "Unless you have objections?" "No." The word came out harder than he intended. "We'll proceed as outlined." The room cleared quickly after that. His team knew better than to linger when Josiah's mood shifted into that particular shade of cold. But Gina took her time gathering her materials, methodical and unhurried. When she finally looked up, they were alone. "Was there something else, Mr. Hale?" "Yes." "No." He didn't know what the answer was supposed to be. "How long have you been with Miller and Associates?" The question was unnecessary. He had her entire background in a file somewhere. "For years. Before that, I was with the district attorney's office." She tilted her head slightly, studying him the way he usually studied balance sheets, looking for the weak points. "Why?" "Because you should be terrified of me, and you're not. Because you're young enough to still believe competence matters more than power. Because I haven't been interested in anything in years, and that's a problem." "Just establishing credentials," he said instead. "This acquisition is worth $3 billion. I don't leave things to chance. Neither do I." The silence that followed wasn't comfortable. It was charged, heavy with something Josiah refused to name. "I'll need you on site for the next 6 weeks," he said abruptly. "The Westbrook legal team is going to fight every clause. I want someone who can anticipate their moves. That's not typically how consultants work. I'm not interested in typical. I'm offering you triple your current rate, direct access to all internal files, and a completion bonus that will exceed your annual salary." He paused. "Unless Miller and Associates can't spare you." It was a power play, and they both knew it. He was buying her time, her expertise, her presence. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "I'll need that offer in writing. You'll have it within the hour." She nodded once, then walked toward the door. But she paused with her hand on the handle, looking back at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Mr. Hale, for what it's worth, your team isn't incompetent. They're just terrified of making mistakes around you." Then she was gone, leaving him alone in the conference room with the unsettling realization that he wanted to know what she thought of him. Wanted to know if she was terrified too. He wasn't sure which answer would be worse. Josiah stood at the window, looking out at the city lights beginning to flicker on as dusk settled over Manhattan. He'd bought and sold companies worth more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. He'd stared down corporate raiders, hostile takeovers, and market crashes without flinching. But Gina Moretti had walked into his domain, challenged his methods, and walked out again without asking permission. And he couldn't stop replaying the conversation in his mind. He didn't want her. Wanting implied vulnerability, need, the potential for loss. He'd eliminated those variables from his life years ago, after watching his father destroy himself over a woman who left anyway. Josiah had learned the lesson well. Control everything, need nothing, and you'll never be destroyed. But he couldn't stop thinking about what it would cost to touch her. Gina's office for the next 6 weeks was a smaller conference room on the 52nd floor. Still luxurious, still offering views that made her hometown of Newark look like a distant memory, but separate enough from Josiah's executive suite that she could breathe. She needed to breathe, because the man was suffocating in his intensity, and she'd only spent 2 hours in his presence. Here's the internal file access you requested. The voice belonged to Marcus Chun, Josiah's executive assistant, who'd appeared at her door with a tablet and an expression that suggested he was making a hostage delivery. Password protected. Changes every 48 hours. Mr. Hale wants daily progress reports by 6 p.m. Of course he does. Gina took the tablet, already scrolling through the directory structure. Does he micromanage everything? Or am I special? Marcus almost smiled. Almost. Everything. Don't take it personally. I don't take anything personally in this business. That was a lie, and they both probably knew it. But Marcus just nodded and left her to the files, the silence, and the uncomfortable awareness that Josiah Hale had just granted her access to information that could unravel his entire acquisition strategy if she wanted it to. He was either supremely confident in her ethics, or he was testing her. Probably both. She worked through lunch, through the afternoon, through the golden hour when the sun turned the office windows into sheets of amber light. The Westbrook acquisition was more complicated than Josiah's team had realized. Layers of subsidiary contracts, liability shields, and offshore holdings that suggested someone very smart had been trying to hide something very big. Gina loved puzzles like this. They made sense. They had rules, patterns, solutions. Unlike the man who'd hired her. You're still here. She looked up to find Josiah standing in her doorway, his suit jacket discarded, his tie loosened just enough to suggest the day had been long. It was past 8 p.m. The office beyond her windows was dark except for scattered lights. Other workaholics. Other people who'd forgotten what normal working hours looked like. So are you, she pointed out. I own the building. I'm always here. He stepped inside, and suddenly the conference room felt smaller. Find anything? Several things. None of them good. She turned her laptop toward him, pulling up the analysis she'd been building. Westbrook has been moving assets through shell companies in the Cayman Islands for the past 18 months. They're trying to sanitize the holdings before the acquisition completes. Josiah moved closer, leaning over her shoulder to read the screen. She could smell his cologne, something expensive and understated, cedar and something darker. How much are they hiding? At least 400 million, possibly more. She pulled up another document. And these subsidiary contracts? They're designed to trigger penalty clauses if you try to consolidate operations. You'd lose 30% of the acquisition value in the first year. He was quiet for a long moment, reading through her notes with an intensity that made her nervous. Then he straightened, and she could feel his gaze on her even though she kept her eyes on the screen. Why didn't my legal team catch this? Because they were looking at the surface structure. This is 3 layers deep. She finally looked up at him. And because whoever designed this strategy knew exactly how corporate due diligence works. They built the traps where no one would think to look. Except you. I used to prosecute financial fraud. You learn to think like the people who build these systems. She closed the laptop. The question is, Do you still want this acquisition? I always get what I want. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that had nothing to do with corporate strategy. Gina stood, gathering her materials with deliberate calm. Then we need to restructure the entire approach. I'll have recommendations by Monday. It's Friday night. I'm aware. You should go home. Eat something. Sleep. He said it like those were foreign concepts he'd heard about, but never personally experienced. I could say the same to you, Mr. Hale. Josiah. The correction was quiet, almost reluctant. If you're going to be working this closely with me, we can skip the formalities. It felt like a concession coming from him, like he was offering something he didn't usually give. Gina knew she should keep the distance, should maintain every professional boundary she'd built in her career, should absolutely not acknowledge the way her pulse had jumped when he'd leaned over her shoulder, or the fact that she'd been aware of his presence in the building all day, even floors apart. Gina, she said finally, and I'll go home when you do. His mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile, but close. That's not a fair wager. I'll be here until midnight. Then I guess I'll be here until midnight too. She thought he might argue. Instead, he just studied her with those cold blue eyes that seemed to see everything she was trying to hide. You're stubborn. I'm thorough. There's a difference. Is there? He moved toward the door, then paused. There's a decent restaurant on the 40th floor. If you're staying, you should eat. It wasn't quite an invitation, more like a statement of fact. But Gina heard the unspoken question underneath. Will you join me? She should say no. Should order something to her office. Maintain the separation. Keep this exactly what it was supposed to be, a professional engagement with a clear end date. What kind of restaurant? She asked instead. The kind that knows better than to ask questions when I show up unannounced. Of course it was. If you're feeling the tension already, drop a comment below. Tell me, should Gina trust him or run? And don't forget to like this video if you're ready for the obsession to get darker. The restaurant was exactly what she'd expected. Low lighting, private booths, a menu without prices, and a staff that materialized and vanished like ghosts. Josiah led her to a corner booth that overlooked the city, 40 floors of power and wealth separating them from the world below. You do this often? Gina asked as they settled into seats across from each other. Midnight dinners with consultants? Never. He didn't elaborate. The waiter appeared, took their orders without writing anything down, and disappeared again. Gina found herself alone with Josiah Hale in a space that felt far too intimate for two people who'd met 12 hours ago. Tell me something, Josiah said, his fingers drumming once against the table before going still, the only sign of restlessness she'd seen from him. Why did you leave the DA's office? Why do you care? I'm trying to understand what drives someone to work the hours you clearly work, with the precision you clearly have. He leaned back slightly. Most people don't push that hard without a reason. Gina considered deflecting, considered giving him the professional answer she'd perfected over the years. But something about the late hour, the darkness beyond the windows, the fact that he'd asked like he actually wanted to know, it made her honest. Because I watched my mother lose everything to a man who hid assets in exactly the kind of shell companies I just found in your acquisition. He left her with nothing, and the legal system couldn't touch him because he'd built his walls too well. She met his gaze steadily. So I learned to tear down those walls. I learned to find what people hide. Josiah absorbed that without expression. And now you do it for billionaires instead of against them. Now I do it for whoever pays me enough to make sure my mother never worries about money again. Practical. Survival. The food arrived. Something elegant that Gina barely tasted. She was too aware of the man across from her, the way he listened like her words mattered, the way he seemed to catalog every detail about her. What about you? She asked. What drives Josiah Hale to build an empire most people couldn't manage in 3 lifetimes? Control. The answer was immediate, unflinching. My father lost everything because he let emotion dictate his decisions. Loved the wrong woman. Trusted the wrong partners, made choices based on hope instead of analysis. He paused. I decided I would never make that mistake. Sounds lonely. Loneliness is just another emotion. You learn to ignore it. Gina didn't believe that. She could see the edges of something else beneath his control, something hungry and restless that didn't fit in the neat boxes he'd built for his life. Is that why you've never married? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Josiah's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. That's a personal question. You asked me personal questions. So I did. He was quiet for a moment. Marriage requires trust. I don't trust easily. Or maybe you don't trust at all. Maybe. He took a drink, his gaze never leaving hers. Does that bother you? It should. It absolutely should. No, Gina heard herself say. But it makes me wonder what you're afraid of. I'm not afraid of anything. Everyone's afraid of something. The silence that followed was different than before, charged with challenge, with curiosity, with something neither of them was willing to name. Josiah leaned forward slightly. And what are you afraid of, Gina? You, she thought. This. The way I can't seem to remember why professional distance matters when you look at me like you're trying to solve an equation that doesn't have numbers. Repeating my mother's mistakes, she said instead. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Josiah seemed to know that. His eyes held hers for a long moment, and Gina had the unsettling feeling that he could see straight through her carefully constructed defenses. Then we'll both be careful, he said finally. Won't we? It sounded like a warning, or maybe a promise. Gina wasn't sure which one terrified her more. They finished the meal in a silence that felt almost comfortable, but underneath it was that constant awareness, the pull she couldn't quite shake, the sense that something was shifting between them that couldn't be shifted back. When Josiah walked her to the elevator bay, he stood just close enough that she could feel the heat of him, could catch that cedar scent again. Thank you for dinner, she said, pressing the button for the lobby. Gina. She looked up at him. This acquisition, it matters, but your work matters more. He paused, and for just a second, his control slipped enough that she could see something raw underneath. Don't let me become another man who takes from you. Then he stepped back, and the elevator doors closed between them. Gina rode down 40 floors in silence, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the descent. He didn't want her, but he couldn't stop thinking about what it would cost to touch her. And somehow, she knew that made them both dangerous. The next 6 weeks fell into a pattern that Gina both craved and feared. She arrived at Hale Corporation at 7 a.m. Josiah was always already there, his office lights visible from the elevator bank like a beacon. They rarely spoke in those early hours. He stayed in his domain, she stayed in hers, but she was aware of him constantly. By 9 a.m., the building filled with employees who walked the halls like they were navigating a minefield. Gina watched how people reacted to Josiah, the fear in their eyes, the way they stuttered through presentations, the visible relief when he dismissed them. She didn't feel that fear. Maybe she should have. Your 3 p.m. is here, Marcus announced one afternoon, appearing in her doorway with a tablet and his usual expression of controlled stress. I don't have a 3 p.m. You do now. Mr. Hale wants you in the executive conference room. Gina saved her work and headed upstairs, curiosity overriding irritation. When she entered the conference room, she found Josiah standing at the head of the table with 3 people she didn't recognize. Older, expensive suits, the kind of lawyers who billed by the minute. This is Gina Moretti, Josiah said without preamble. She's lead counsel on the Westbrook acquisition. Whatever she says is my position. The 3 visitors looked at her with barely concealed skepticism. One of them, a silver-haired man who radiated condescension, actually smiled. Ms. Moretti, we represent Westbrook Industries. We'd like to discuss certain concerns about the acquisition terms. It was a test. Gina realized that immediately. Josiah had put her in front of opposing counsel without warning, without preparation, to see how she'd handle the pressure. Most people would have panicked. Gina sat down at the table, folded her hands, and smiled back. I'm sure you would. Let's start with the $400 million in hidden assets you've been moving through offshore subsidiaries. The silver-haired lawyer's smile vanished. For the next 2 hours, Gina methodically dismantled every legal argument they presented, every attempt to negotiate away the penalty clauses she'd discovered, every carefully phrased threat about walking away from the deal. Josiah never said a word. He just stood at the window, watching the city, listening to her destroy his opposition with the same precision she brought to everything. When the Westbrook team finally left, subdued, outmaneuvered, and significantly less confident, Gina let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. You could have warned me, she said. Josiah turned from the window. Would you have prepared differently? No. Then there was no point. He moved closer, and she saw something in his expression she hadn't seen before, approval. Maybe even pride. You're better than my entire legal team combined. That's not a high bar, based on what I've seen. His mouth curved slightly. No, it's not. He paused. They'll try to go around you now. Directly to me. Let them. Gina stood, gathering her notes. You'll just send them back to me anyway. Will I? Yes. Because you don't waste time on battles you've already won, and you know I'll win this one. She walked past him toward the door, but his voice stopped her. Gina. She turned back. Josiah was watching her with an intensity that made her pulse jump. You were right, that first day. My team isn't incompetent. They're just terrified of making mistakes. He took a step closer. You're not terrified. Should I be? Most people are. Of me. Of this. He gestured vaguely at the office, the empire, the weight of power that surrounded him like armor. You walk through it like it doesn't exist. Maybe I just don't believe power is the same thing as control. Then what is? Gina met his gaze steadily, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. Knowing when to let go. Something shifted in his expression, recognition, maybe, or challenge. He took another step closer. Close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the silver just starting to thread through his dark hair. Close enough that she could feel the pull of him like gravity. I don't let go, he said quietly. I know. That doesn't bother you. It should. It absolutely should. No, she whispered. It terrifies me. The confession hung between them, honest and raw and completely stupid to admit. Josiah's hand lifted, almost involuntarily, like he was going to touch her face. Then he seemed to catch himself, his control slamming back into place like a door closing. This is a mistake, he said, but he didn't move away. Probably. You're 28 years old. And you're 42. I can do math, Josiah. I'm your client. Technically, Hale Corporation is my client. That's semantics. Yes. She took a breath, forcing herself to step back even though every instinct screamed at her to move closer. It is. The distance felt like a physical loss. Josiah's jaw tightened, and for just a second, she saw the cost of his control, the effort it took to maintain those walls, to keep everything locked down and perfect and safe. Go home, Gina, he said finally, his voice rough. Before I do something we'll both regret. She should have left. Should have walked out and never looked back. Instead, she heard herself ask, would you regret it? His eyes locked on hers, and the hunger she saw there was enough to steal her breath. Yes, he said, but I'd do it anyway. Then he turned away, dismissing her with the same cold efficiency he used for everything else in his life. Gina left, but she felt his gaze on her all the way to the elevator, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that something had just shifted between them that couldn't be shifted back. He called her his mistake, but he couldn't let her go, and God help them both, she didn't want him to. The next morning, there were flowers on her desk. Not roses, too obvious, too romantic. These were white orchids, elegant and cold and perfect. No card, no signature, nothing to explain them except the obvious. Josiah Hale had been thinking about her. Gina stared at them for a long moment, then picked up her phone. His assistant answered on the first ring. Mr. Hale's office. Tell him thank you, she said. But it doesn't change anything. I'll convey the message. Marcus paused. For what it's worth, he's never sent flowers to anyone before. The call ended before she could respond. Gina sat down at her desk, surrounded by white orchids and the scent of cedar that seemed to linger everywhere Josiah had been, and wondered what the hell she was doing. She was falling for a man who didn't believe in emotions, who saw attachment as weakness, who would control everything around him rather than risk being vulnerable for even a second. She should run. But when Josiah appeared in her doorway an hour later, his expression carefully neutral, all she could think was how much she wanted to see him lose that control. Conference call with Westbrook in 10 minutes, he said. Your office or mine? Yours. She stood, gathering her notes. We should present a unified front. They walked to the elevator side by side, not touching, the space between them charged with everything they weren't saying. About the flowers, he started. Don't. He looked at her sharply. Don't explain them. Don't apologize for them. Don't tell me they were a mistake. Gina pressed the button for the 54th floor. Just don't. The elevator doors closed, sealing them in together. Josiah was quiet for a moment. Then, what if they were a mistake? Then you'll have to live with it. Just like I'm living with the fact that I didn't walk away when I should have. The elevator climbed, floor after floor, while the tension between them built like a storm about to break. Gina, we have a conference call, she interrupted. Let's focus on that. It was a dismissal, a boundary, the smart thing to do. But when they stepped out of the elevator onto his floor, Josiah caught her wrist, gentle but firm enough to stop her. I don't know how to do this, he said quietly. Whatever this is. Gina looked down at his hand on her wrist, then up at his face. Neither do I. Then maybe we shouldn't. Probably not. But neither of them moved. Marcus's voice crackled over the intercom. Mr. Hale, Westbrook, is on the line. Josiah released her wrist slowly, his fingers trailing across her skin in a way that felt deliberate. Intimate. After the call, he said. We talk. It wasn't a request. Gina nodded, not trusting her voice. Then they walked into his office together, and for the next hour, they were nothing but professional. Clinical. Perfect. But underneath it, they both knew. The line had already been crossed, and there was no going back. The conference call lasted 90 minutes. 90 minutes of legal strategy, financial projections, and carefully worded threats disguised as negotiations. Gina watched Josiah operate with the precision of a surgeon, cutting through arguments, redirecting conversations, cornering Westbrook's team until they had nowhere left to maneuver. He was brilliant, ruthless, completely in control. But every time he glanced at her across the desk, she saw the cracks in that control. When the call finally ended, Marcus appeared in the doorway like he'd been summoned by telepathy. Your 4 o'clock is waiting, he said to Josiah. Cancel it. Marcus blinked. Sir, it's the quarterly board review. I said cancel it. Josiah's voice was flat, absolute. Clear my schedule for the rest of the afternoon. Marcus looked between them, his expression carefully neutral, then nodded and disappeared. The door clicked shut. Silence filled the office, heavy, charged, dangerous. Josiah stood from behind his desk, loosening his tie with movements that looked almost restless. He walked to the windows, his back to her, tension visible in every line of his body. I told myself I wouldn't do this, he said finally. Gina stayed seated, her hands folded in her lap to keep them from shaking. Do what? Want you? The words were quiet, brutal in their honesty. I told myself it was just proximity. Attraction. Something I could control if I maintained enough distance. And he turned to face her, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. I was wrong. Gina stood slowly, every instinct screaming at her to be careful, to protect herself, to remember all the reasons this was a terrible idea. Josiah, I'm 42 years old, he continued, his voice rough. I've built everything in my life on discipline and control. I don't make impulsive decisions. I don't let emotion dictate strategy. He took a step toward her. But I can't stop thinking about you. Can't stop wondering what you think, what drives you, what you'd sound like if I made you lose control the way you make me lose mine. The confession hit her like a physical force. You haven't lost control, she whispered. Haven't I? Another step closer. I sent you flowers. I canceled a board meeting. I'm standing here telling you things I've never told anyone, because apparently you've dismantled every wall I've spent 2 decades building. Gina's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. This is a bad idea. I know. I work for you. Technically, you work for Miller and Associates. That's still semantics. Yes. He was close now. Close enough that she could see the conflict in his eyes. Want versus control, desire versus discipline. It is. She should walk away. Should maintain every professional boundary she'd ever learned. Should remember that men like Josiah Hale didn't just want. They consumed, possessed, controlled. But she'd spent her whole life being careful, being smart, protecting herself from exactly this kind of risk. And she was so tired of being careful. What do you want from me? She asked. Josiah's hand lifted, his fingers barely brushing her jaw. The first time he'd really touched her, and it felt like fire. Everything. Nothing. I don't know. His thumb traced her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. I just know I can't keep pretending you're just another consultant. What am I then? The biggest mistake I'm ever going to make. It should have hurt. Should have made her pull away. Instead, Gina leaned into his touch, her eyes locked on his. Then make it. Something broke in his expression, control shattering like glass. Josiah kissed her. Not gently. Not carefully. He kissed her like he'd been starving for it. Like every wall he'd built had just collapsed at once, and this was the only thing that made sense anymore. Gina gasped against his mouth, her hands fisting in his shirt, and kissed him back with equal hunger. She tasted coffee and mint and something darker, desperation, maybe, or need that had been denied too long. His hands moved to her waist, pulling her closer, and she went willingly, recklessly, every rational thought dissolving under the heat of his touch. This was insane, unprofessional, exactly the kind of mistake her mother had warned her about. Powerful men, broken boundaries, consequences that couldn't be undone. But Gina couldn't bring herself to care. Josiah's mouth moved to her throat, her jaw back to her lips with bruising intensity. His control was gone completely now, replaced by something raw and hungry that matched the ache building in her chest. Gina. Her name was a prayer, a curse, a confession all at once. She pulled back just enough to look at him. His hair disheveled from her fingers, his eyes dark with want, his carefully constructed composure in complete ruins. Don't regret this, she whispered. Whatever happens after, don't regret this. Josiah's hand cupped her face, his thumb brushing her swollen lips. I'm going to regret everything about this, but I'm going to do it anyway. Then he kissed her again, slower this time, but no less intense. Like he was memorizing the taste of her, the feel of her, every detail of this moment before reality came crashing back. The intercom buzzed, sharp, intrusive, wrong. They broke apart, breathing hard, the spell shattered. Marcus's voice filtered through. Mr. Hale, I have the Westbrook team calling back. They say it's urgent. Josiah closed his eyes, his jaw tightening as control reasserted itself with visible effort. Tell them 10 minutes. Yes, sir. The silence that followed felt like a chasm opening between them. Josiah stepped back, running a hand through his hair, his expression shifting into something cold and distant, the mask sliding back into place with practiced ease. This can't happen again, he said. Gina felt the words like a physical blow. Josiah. I'm serious, Gina. This was... He gestured vaguely between them, like he couldn't find words for what they'd just done. A lapse in judgment. It won't happen again. Pride and hurt warred in her chest. She wanted to scream at him, wanted to demand he acknowledge what had just passed between them, wanted to break through that control one more time. But she was tired of wanting things from men who couldn't give them. Fine. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. We'll pretend it never happened. Something flickered across his face. Regret, maybe, or loss. But it was gone before she could identify it. That would be best. Gina gathered her notes with hands that only shook slightly, pride keeping her spine straight and her expression neutral. I'll have the revised acquisition strategy on your desk by end of day. Gina, don't. She met his eyes, letting him see exactly what his dismissal had cost. You don't get to kiss me like that and then pretend I'm just another employee. Pick one, Josiah. But you don't get both. Then she walked out, leaving him alone in his office with his control and his regret and the taste of her still on his lips. She made it to the elevator before the tears started. What happens next will change everything. Josiah has called her a mistake and pushed her away. But can he really let her go? And will Gina walk away from the one man who makes her feel everything she's been trying to avoid? The next 3 days will test them both. Professional distance, cold silences, and a rooftop confession that neither of them saw coming. If you need to know what happens next, hit that subscribe button right now. Part 2 drops soon, and trust me, you don't want to miss the moment Josiah's control finally breaks completely. Drop a comment and tell me, should Gina forgive him? Or should she run while she still can? And smash that like button if this story has you completely hooked.